This is Leisha Holmes, and I'm your host on the Recruiters Recruitment Podcast. And I'm just excited today for a number of reasons, not least because one of our amazing podcast partners, the Inclusion Crowd, Ed Jervis, actually introduced me to this guest. We were talking off camera, we think it's actually about 3 years ago, which is scary. And this is possibly also our third or fourth guest from a beautiful part of the world that I've actually not had a chance to come to yet, but now I definitely need to. Our third Austinite. This is Dr. Lynette Reed, and Lynette is an awareness coach, a principal inclusion specialist, and think tank member for the Inclusion Crowd. So welcome to you today. How are you?
Thank you. Doing great today. How about you? Everything going well over there?
Everything is we are in an interesting time. As we record this in March 2023, I think our industry is where your industry was at in autumn 2022, which is mass sort of exodus and mass redundancies in the tech world, having a huge impact on internal recruitment and talent acquisition, cost of living crisis. Just turn the news off, everybody. But no, I'm doing great, thank you. This is the middle of my day. What's our time difference to the UK?
Well, it's really funny. I've actually got a great story on that. I do a lot of work with people in the UK, in that area of the world. And we have what's called daylight savings time, where the time moves. And so what I learned the hard way was that I had some meetings and I kept missing them because what's your daylight savings? I think it's called best our summertime.
Yeah, British summertime. We're changing in a week or so.
It changes in a week. It changes a week after us. So we've got 1 week where it's only a 5-hour difference as opposed to a 6-hour difference. So I had to remember that today so that I was here at 8 instead of 7.
I've done it before. I've done it before. I had some guests on and they were based over in Hong Kong. And I remember, I'll never forget, I was going, because I do try and do a massive walk before I do a podcast day, because I'm literally sat for about 8 hours. And I was in the middle of a country park and I got a message saying, right, we're in the Zoom. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they were like, we're in the Zoom. And I'm like, no, it's in another hour. And they were like, no.
Yeah.
And I'd done this. I think our clocks had either just gone back or forward, whichever way around it was. So how wonderful. And the fact that we both share a global community. So would you like to explain, obviously I've introduced you, but what do you actually do? What's your niche?
Well, mine's kind of a really odd degree field. I have no idea how I got to where I am right now, but my degree is actually, my doctorate's in a field called spirituality, sustainability, and interreligious dialogue. But really what it's talking about is how are we connected to each other, to ourselves, and to the world. And really when you're talking about spirit, that's what you're talking about, because it's breath. It's how with every breath you take, you get to decide how you're going to live your life. And I had a hard time using the word spirituality, though, because people would think religion or crystals. Those were the two big ones I got. And so I had to kind of change it to the vocabulary of human potential and our self-awareness and, how we do things. And some people call it emotional intelligence. And so really what happened was I made a model when I was in my many years ago, and I continue to teach that model today. And it really just has 3 parts to it. And when you do those 3 things together in a cycle, it helps strengthen things like culture, critical thinking skills, things like that. So
wow.
So it's kind of, I go to teach people how to do that. Yeah, because it's not something you commonly find.
No, it really isn't. And you're the first guest I've ever had that comes from this sort of, and I can see why Ed has connected us.
Kind of.
I can see in that, and I can also see why you're involved in the Inclusion Crowd, because I think just before we come on to your 3-part change model, I think that there's a real narrative at the moment in the leadership community that I'm part of around self-awareness or lack thereof. So I think this is actually a very timely conversation for those leaders listening who we have, right across the globe. So how does your 3-part change model sort of buy into that in terms of how do we know whether we're self-aware? I could say, I'm self-aware. What does it actually mean to be self-aware?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, right? To me, it's about being able to understand those connections. Am I self-aware enough to know the reason I'm doing the things that I'm doing and how they impact me and impact other people? In fact, right now I'm writing an article I do articles for an organization called MPUG, which is a project management one. And what I'm writing about right now, so it's forefront in my mind, is instant gratification. How do you know if the things you're doing are to just make yourself feel better, or are they to help build and strengthen that common goal? And so the thing I usually tell people is, you got to ask yourself the question, are you trying to strengthen something or fracture it? So like if you yell at somebody, if you're yelling at somebody, what are you doing? Are you fracturing or strengthening it? And so you just have to kind of ask yourself the question, because that way that you've got that self-awareness of, oh, hey, this is really impacting somebody, or it's really impacting me, So that's kind of forefront in my mind right now, just because I'm writing that article. So.
We always answer. We always go immediately to the first thing that comes into our minds, and that's fine. So I'm going to ask something a bit contrary, really, and possibly a little bit I guess contradictory to the actual phrase self-awareness. Are we best understanding our own sense of self-awareness, or do we need to actually ask for feedback from other people on what we think our self-awareness is? If I say I'm like, I think I'm really empathetic, I think I've got real integrity, I think I'm very honest and straight talking. Am I the right person to say those things, or should I be asking the people that engage with me on a daily basis whether I'm those things?
I think it's a mix. I think one of the things that I'm seeing a lot in society right now, there's this thing, I don't know if you're familiar with binary thinking. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah.
So it's like, so if you're into binary thinking, it's like, okay, it either has to be this or it has to be this. And with critical thinking, which is the opposite of binary thinking, you're thinking, okay, what are all of my options here? So if you think I'm a friendly person, you could say, hey, okay, I think I'm a friendly person. I may want to get some feedback from some people. I may want to see if I'm getting the reaction of what friendly people would get back from people. We can think of it from that bigger perspective of, it doesn't have to be just myself telling myself that, or somebody else telling me, because sometimes people might say, you're not very friendly. And you may go, well, I think I'm friendly. And they may just have a different definition of what friendly means. And so it's real hard to just say, okay, I'm friendly. You have to kind of be able to internally do it and externally do it at the same time.
Subjectively, isn't it? No, I do actually really subscribe to that. And Simon Sinek is always talking around that, isn't he? The concept that you can actually be, somebody that's really sociable, but equally at the same time feel quite lonely. That we're not one thing or another. It's being honest and open, sort of to know that yourself. So in terms of taking us through that, and I know we're not asking you to impart your entire doctorate and what you do for a profession, but just from a snapshot point of view, how do we ensure, if we're listening to this podcast, it's because generally speaking, we're wanting to improve ourselves. That's why people take 20 minutes to drop into a podcast. So what do we need to do you think, as a starting point to ensure that we become more self-aware? Are there sort of some guidelines that you can give us?
Yes. Well, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and this has held true for all that time. And I like to use the analogy of, you actually have a magic wand, especially if you're like a Harry Potter fan or something like that, it plays well. But, the big thing is your words and actions matching. If you think about the people who are authentic or have that sense of themselves, that's the big one. So really, it's it's easy, but it's hard at the same time, because to say make your words and actions match, that's real easy to do. But then whenever you have to actually do it, and that goes for two parts. One is for the commitments you make, but also for saying who you want to be as a person. So like the first part of the model is coming up with kind of what I call your intentional mission, which is an internal behavior that you're going to identify as how you want to present yourself and treat people in the world. So it could be friendly, helpful, kind. Now, if it's mean-spirited or hateful, that may be a totally different discussion. Normally, I'm working with people who are trying to strengthen things. So we're talking, the kind of the kinder, more gentler words. But then you have to do that even whenever things are really, really hard. So if, for instance, you're a boss or a leader and somebody does something really bad that just fractures horribly, you can't yell at them if you're trying to make your word friendly. You have to say, look, you really messed up and we need to fix this, but let's move forward and see if we can do it this way, and maybe they have to be fired, but you can do it in a friendly way as opposed to saying, oh my God, that was terrible. You're get out of here,
I
So,
think that's really effective. The words and actions matching, that's going to be definitely the name of the podcast, because I think that that's so easily within reach of anyone listening, whether you're a leader, whether you're a recruiter starting out, or whoever you are listening, we've all got that within our reach. And actually that is like a wow moment, isn't it? Because that's to me what integrity really means. It's joining the dots. Because we can all say, oh yeah, I'm really ethical and I'm always going to go out and do the best that I can, and then finding out that you're not paying your suppliers or whatever it might be, or cheating on your wife or whatever it is. It's words and actions matter, that they must match. I love that. So that's number one.
I call it the magic wand. You just have to do it. Yeah.
I was looking around. I have actually got a Harry Potter wand. We went to Harry Potter World in Borehamwood when it first opened, and actually this is a total aside. It was when my children were much, much younger, and we'd never actually seen a Harry Potter film at the time, which is just stupid. But it was brilliant. If ever you get a chance to go, you must go. So somewhere in my house there is a Harry Potter one, but imaginary one. So that's number one.
I have to admit that I actually did too. They have one in Universal. And we went with my brother, my kids, and I went down there and did the whole Harry Potter thing. My kids were very big into reading it when it came out. So
yeah, I have to say, even if you're not a Harry Potter fan, you should just go anyway. It's brilliant. So moving Harry Potter to one side. So what's number two?
Number two is the words and actions matching. Actually,
right. So that's number
one. And the third one kind of goes to the whole thing on binary thinking versus critical thinking. And it used to be, I had a counselor friend once tell me that the further away from reality your expectations were, the more distressed you would become. And so one of the things that kind of came out of that was many, many years ago, was that judging things as good or bad or wrong or right. And this is a really tough one because like, for instance, if I say that the way you did that was wrong, well, that's very different than saying that's not the way I wanted you to do it. You know what I mean? And it's a real subtle difference, but it just changes the whole dynamic, because if you're doing things based off of a value judgment of good or bad or wrong or right, you're doing it off of it's a whole class in and of itself, but it has to do with your fear level. If you're fearful of your value as a person, it's good to judge people as good or bad, because then you get to decide where you are in that mix. Oh, they're bad at their job, so I'm good at my job.
Wow.
And so you value system. So if you don't judge things as good or bad or wrong or right, and you just judge them kind of as, how am I going to deal with this situation? What's happening? Then you completely change the dynamic of the group. And in HR, I think it's really important, because when you're dealing with a lot of conflict type of things, instead of saying, wow, you did a really bad job of that, you say, look, that did not turn out the way it needed to. Here's our expectations. We expect your actions to match this.
Right, words and actions to match. Exactly. Two things I want to pick up on there is the language that you use, and I don't know whether NLP has any part to play in that. We have to be mindful of the language that we're using, and we can address things to ourselves and to the other people, whether it's our team members or whatever. And then the other thing, which is a massive thing in recruitment, is managing expectations. And again, that comes back to communication, doesn't it? So if you're sat in that meeting that you've just described there, and it's, that was wrong, but actually if you redress it and say, look, when we set this out, these were the expectations, this is where you're at now, and that's not where we intended the expectations to be, that's a whole different conversation to this is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also, like if somebody does something really well, where you're like, oh, I really like the way you did that. If you just say that's good, well, then they start to feel like, oh, I've got to have that feeling of good. Whereas if you say, wow, this job that you did the thing we wanted it to do, then you're focusing on the actions and the activities, as opposed to the fact that you're giving them a value judgment. Well done. That's a nice place to be. Yeah,
without shadow.
Yeah, it's a real subtle difference, but it can make all the difference in the world whenever you're talking to people, especially if you're a team leader and you've
Mm.
got to give people a lot of feedback. If you say, wow, that was a really good job, well, they're going to think, oh, good. I've got to be good. Whereas if you say, wow, I really like that you did this, and defining it, then they know, oh, okay, this is what the expectation is, and this is
Mm.
what's going to get me that sense of I'm on track, I'm going
Yeah.
forward in the
And
right way.
it's not exclusively one-way traffic here, leaders down into the team. This can be managing upwards into, or lead, talking to your leaders. If you're listening now, we get a lot of people starting their careers. You have expectations of your leadership team to train you, to support you psychologically, to ensure that you're mentally and physically looked after, to ensure that there are opportunities, whatever your expectations are. And actually, I also want to throw something else in here. As a parent, this works. Setting
Yeah,
expectations, or
yes.
whether you run a sports team, this isn't exclusively within a business context. Actually, everything you're talking about, I think, and I got trained in managing expectations right at the start of my career, and I realize now what an absolute legendary form of training that was, because from that day, every relationship I had, even like I'm in a fairly new relationship, 4 years with my boyfriend, right from the start we set expectations, literally on our first date, of what we expected of each other. And it creates, I think, we go back to self-awareness. This is my role in this relationship. So whether it's you and your leader, you and your colleague, you and your mentor, you and your children, that you know exactly where you stand.
100%, yeah. And you've got the authenticity if the words and actions are matching on top of it. So
Just that,
yeah.
I love that we keep coming back to that. Now, as well as being an incredible human being, and obviously, seriously expert in what you do, you're also a very successful author. And I think that if I think about, we've connected obviously through Ed, who found me on LinkedIn. I want to bring this back to LinkedIn particularly because that's where most of my audience sits anyway. There's so much noise out there, and I'm not saying there's mimicry, but it's really hard to stand out. It's really hard to, I guess, own your own story. And what I think we get a lot of feedback from people who almost feel that they get carried along on someone else's journey, someone else's story. And how do we ensure that we own our own story, whether it's in whatever career defining moment we want, or whether it's just in our personal life?
Yeah, well, there's so many parts to that, but I was kind of thinking as you were talking, I really feel like there's the big things are, first of all, being kind of that self-awareness, true to yourself, kind of my personal journey was actually, I started out as a speech pathologist many years ago. I'm dating myself here, but many years ago. And I did not enjoy it. I mean, it's a great profession. It's a wonderful thing to do, but I just was not enjoying it. And so I, against all odds, I had 2 kids and a very supportive husband. And I said, I'm going to go back to school and get this really weird degree. And I had no idea what I was going to do with it. But I just said, I just
Amazing.
really feel like this is something I need to do. And so I think, to me, you have to, but I think you do have to have that sense of who you are and where you want to go, because then it gives you that strength to do it. And so I think that's real important. And that's why I think that the model that I designed, actually, I kind of designed it to be able for people to be able to say, hey, we want to get out there and do something and be brave and not let these fears decide where we're going to go, and make these decisions. And that's why I think, for me, why I keep pushing the words and actions thing, because it's real easy to say, oh, I want to be this or I want to be that. But until you really just get out there and make that happen. And I think the second thing is hard work. I actually watched a video today, or this morning. I was up early, and I was on Netflix. I hate to admit, just watching. It was about the history of pop. And one of the things,
Ah,
yeah, it was really kind of cool. They were talking about why Sweden apparently is a big mecca for pop music. And they were talking about all of the history of it and ABBA and all of that. And one of the things that kept coming up in the discussion was hard work, hard work. And I thought, oh, okay, that does make sense. And so I think, it's like I said before, it's not one thing. It's, having that self-awareness, some hard work, knowing what direction you want to go, things like that. So
I think that's really important for certain people listening who maybe, get cast, there's aspersions cast, and it's not very inclusive to make people of a certain generation be, cast in this, lazy Generation Z, and they're flaky and they have expectations. Actually, that's far from it. You could say that about Generation X not understanding tech. I mean, that you can't make these huge, massive assumptions, and I will always challenge that. But I think hard work, if you work harder than somebody next to you who's got equal ability, you will get further than them. It is as simple as that. And I'm really pleased you brought that up. Before we finish, I do just want to bring something up, because we've not discussed this off camera, but I think what you're basically, the whole notion of what you're saying is about carving out your own best path in life. And I think where I have, and I don't know whether you do this, and that's why I'm throwing this at you a little bit. I think that due to, and I know your education system, although there's differences in the UK and across the world, wherever you're listening to this, because it's so centralized and generalized, so many young people come out of school disillusioned, not knowing what words and actions to take to understand who they are and what they want to be. And I'm saying that as a mum, and I'm saying that as, understanding their cohort. And I think there's a massive disconnect between how the education system churns out and has a conveyor system, which I'm not an educator, so I don't know how you'd solve this, but maybe we need to, as adults, as parents, maybe if you are listening and you've got influence in education or politics, we need to change the mindset of how young people think about themselves before they get to come out of graduation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think I was actually talking to somebody about that the other day. We were talking about how, and I don't know if it's the same there, but here we still kind of use the agrarian, the industrial revolution model. And so the question then becomes, with technologies that we have and the ability to travel like we do, is there a way to make it so that kids can, go out and do things? I know with our kids, we always kind of felt like our kids went to public school here in Salado, and we always felt like the public education did a good job of the basics, but we traveled a lot with them because then they learned firsthand things that they were never going to learn in a room. And so you're right. That is a really good question for educators, is how do we move education into this new technological age where kids, they are different. They were raised on phones and games and things like that. How do we
virtual reality?
Yeah.
You can transport a child to ancient Greece through a VR goggles. But I applaud that you did that with your children, because I did the same, and I often used to get into trouble, actually, especially when they're in primary school, that I'd be like, I'm taking them out of school, we're going on this trip, and this is where we're going. We're going to, let's say, we went to Israel a couple of times. They're going to learn a lot more going to Jerusalem than they are, I'm not being funny, sat in a classroom learning about SATs. Unofficially, the head used to say, do it, go, but just say the real, because you used to get fined.
Well, we used to joke about it because in our school, you had I think it was like 14 days or something that you could miss before you had to go before, the committee to say, why are you absent so much? And we would actually call in to our Miss Jackson, who was our front desk lady, and say, okay, how many more days do we have before we're going to get in trouble? And so we would use up to the day that we were going to get in trouble, and then to pull them out for that. So
that's bloody brilliant. Oh, this has been so much fun, and the time's just flown. It really has. We are going to make sure that we've got links to your profile, and I don't know if you've got any books coming out or been out during 2023, but if there's anything like that, we'll share it with absolute pleasure, because you have been so delightful, and I'm hoping that it will manifest some wonderful things for you. And if you ever come over to the UK, you must arrange a coffee for you, me, and Ed.
Most definitely. Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing y'all sometime soon. So
definitely. Thank you for joining us on the Recruiters Recruitment Podcast.